Good evening, divas. Tonight's superstar needs no introduction. She is famous for possessing one of the most technically perfect voices in popular music history, selling over 250 million records worldwide and commanding stages with seemingly effortless confidence. She is Miss Celine Dion. But what if I told you that behind that powerhouse voice lived a woman so crippled by panic attacks that she once considered walking away from music entirely? Picture this. It's 1993 and Celine is backstage at Radio City Music Hall, hyperventilating into a paper bag, her hands shaking so violently she can barely hold her microphone. In 30 minutes, she'll walk onto that stage and deliver a performance so flawless that critics will call it transcendent. But right now, she's convinced she's dying, that her heart will explode before she sings a single note. This was Celine's hidden reality for nearly 2 decades, a secret battle with anxiety so severe it would have destroyed lesser artists. But before we begin this journey, let us know in the comments where you are listening tonight. It is always fascinating to learn where in the world you are, and please take a moment to like this video if you enjoy these personal glimpses and subscribe to the channel. It helps more than you realise. Now dim the lights, grab whatever beverage takes your fancy, and prepare to discover the hidden struggle behind Celine Dion's seemingly effortless mastery. Chapter 1. The Seeds of Perfection and Fear. In the small town of Charlemagne, Quebec, something extraordinary was brewing in the Dion household, but it came with a price that no one could have anticipated. Imagine, if you will, a modest home bursting with music, where 14 children, yes, 14, filled every corner with laughter, arguments, and most importantly, song. It was March 30th, 1968, and Adhémar and Thérèse Dion welcomed their youngest daughter into this beautiful chaos, unknowingly setting the stage for both triumph and torment. The Dion family wasn't wealthy by any stretch of the imagination. Adhémar worked as a butcher while also playing accordion in local venues, and Thérèse managed their ever-expanding brood with the kind of fierce love and organisational skills that only mothers of large families truly understand. But what they lacked in material wealth, they more than made up for in musical richness. The house practically vibrated with melody from dawn to dusk. Her parents had formed a small band called Le Trio Dion, and weekend gatherings often turned into impromptu concerts where every family member was expected to contribute something to the evening's entertainment. Young Celine was different from the start, though not in the way you might expect from someone destined for global stardom. She was painfully shy, often hiding behind her mother's skirt when visitors came calling, her small hands trembling when attention focused on her. This wasn't mere childhood bashfulness. Even her siblings noticed how Celine would physically retreat when put in the spotlight, her breathing becoming shallow and rapid. But when music filled the air, something magical and contradictory happened. This timid little girl would transform, her voice emerging with a clarity and power that seemed impossible for someone so small and frightened. The transformation was so complete it was almost unsettling. Family members would watch in amazement as their shy little Celine would step forward, her entire demeanour changing the moment she began to sing. Her posture would straighten, her voice would soar with confidence, and she would command the room with an authority that seemed to come from somewhere beyond her years. But the moment the song ended, she would shrink back into herself, the anxiety returning like a tide rushing back to shore. Her mother, Thérèse, was the first to notice this pattern. The way Celine seemed to live in 2 different worlds, one where she was powerful and confident, and another where she was consumed by worry and self-doubt. Thérèse began to understand that her youngest daughter's gift came with a complexity that would require careful nurturing. She started creating safe spaces for Celine to perform, beginning with family gatherings where the stakes felt lower, where mistakes would be met with encouragement rather than judgment. By age 5, Celine was performing at her brother Michel's wedding, standing on a table because she was too small to be seen otherwise. But what the guests didn't see was the hour beforehand, where Therese had to coax her daughter out of the bathroom where she had been hiding, tears streaming down her face, convinced she would forget the words or her voice would crack. When she finally took that makeshift stage, belting out songs with apparent confidence, the guests were stunned into silence, then erupted into applause that seemed to go on forever. It was perhaps the first time Celine experienced both the intoxicating power of holding an audience in the palm of her hand and the crushing weight of expectation that would follow her for decades. The early years were filled with these contradictions. Celine would beg her mother to let her perform, then spend the hours before each performance in a state of near panic. She developed elaborate rituals to calm herself, specific prayers, breathing exercises, and what she would later describe as conversations with her voice, as if she needed to convince this powerful instrument inside her to cooperate with her terrified mind. Her siblings began to recognize the signs, the way Celine would pace before performances, the way she would practice the same song dozens of times until it was absolutely perfect, the way she would ask endless questions about who would be in the audience and whether they would like her. What they interpreted as perfectionism was actually the beginning of a coping mechanism that would both fuel her success and nearly destroy her. But talent, even talent shadowed by anxiety, has a way of demanding to be heard. What happened next would set the stage for one of the most remarkable transformations in music history and the beginning of a secret struggle that would define Celine's relationship with her own extraordinary gift. Chapter 2. The Manager, the Demo, and the Birth of a Beautiful Prison. Picture this scene. A desperate mother mortgaging her house to pay for a demo recording of her 12-year-old daughter, while that same daughter sits in the corner of the studio hyperventilating because she's convinced the microphone will somehow steal her voice forever. It sounds like the setup for either a fairy tale or a cautionary tale, and in Celine's case, it would prove to be both. The year was 1980, and Celine Dion was making perhaps the biggest gamble of her life, borrowing money against their family home to fund what she believed would be Celine's ticket to stardom. But what Therese couldn't have known was that she was also funding the creation of what would become, in many ways, a beautiful prison for her daughter, a career that would demand perfection from someone whose greatest fear was falling short of expectations. The song was called Ce n'était qu'un rêve. It was only a dream, written by Celine herself along with her brother Jacques and mother Thérèse. Even at 12, Celine possessed an intuitive understanding of melody and emotion that seasoned songwriters would envy. But the recording session revealed the first glimpses of the anxiety that would plague her career. She insisted on take after take, never satisfied that her performance was good enough, her young voice trembling not just with emotion, but with genuine fear that she would disappoint everyone who believed in her. The studio engineer, a kind man named Pierre, who had worked with countless young hopefuls, later recalled that he had never seen a child so simultaneously gifted and tormented. Between takes, Celine would retreat to a corner, her breathing rapid and shallow, her hands shaking as she clutched a small cross her mother had given her. But when the red recording light came on, she would transform completely, delivering performances that seemed to channel something far beyond her years or experience. Thérèse had heard of a man named René Angelil, a former singer-turned-manager who had a reputation for recognizing talent. She packaged up that precious demo tape and mailed it to his office in Montreal, along with a heartfelt letter explaining that her daughter possessed a voice that needed to be heard by the world, though she couldn't bring herself to mention the panic attacks that had become part of Celine's routine. Then came the waiting, the kind of anxious anticipation that only parents of gifted children truly understand, made worse by watching Celine torture herself with worry about whether this stranger would think she was good enough. When René finally listened to the tape, the story goes that he was moved to tears before the song was even finished. Here's a man who had heard thousands of hopeful demos, who knew the music business inside and out, and yet something about this young girl's voice reached through the speakers and grabbed him by the heart. What he couldn't hear, of course, was the anxiety that had nearly prevented the recording from happening at all, the hours of preparation and self-doubt that had gone into those 3.5 minutes of apparent effortless beauty. The day Renée Angelil first met Celine Dion, she was wearing her best dress and clutching her mother's hand like a lifeline, her palms so sweaty that Thérèse had to keep wiping them with a handkerchief. She was still that shy little girl from Charlemagne, but now the stakes felt impossibly high. When Renée asked her to sing, Celine's first instinct was to run from the room. She later described feeling like the walls were closing in, like she couldn't breathe, like her heart was beating so fast it might explode. But then something remarkable happened, something that would become the pattern for the rest of her career. The moment she began to sing, all that anxiety transformed into something else, not disappearing, but becoming fuel for a performance of such raw emotion and technical brilliance that Renée knew, without a shadow of doubt, that he was witnessing the beginning of something extraordinary. The fear that had nearly silenced her became, paradoxically, the source of the vulnerability and authenticity that would define her artistry. Renée made a decision that would change both their lives forever. He agreed to manage Celine, but more than that, he believed in her so completely that he mortgaged his own house to finance her early career. 2 families, betting everything on the voice of a teenage girl who couldn't even speak English yet, and who lived in constant fear that her gift would somehow abandon her. But Renée saw something beyond just vocal talent, something that Celine herself couldn't yet understand. He recognised that her anxiety, rather than being an obstacle to overcome, was actually inseparable from what made her performances so powerful. The vulnerability that terrified her was the same quality that would allow her to connect with audiences on a profound emotional level. The question was whether she could learn to harness that fear without being destroyed by it. What neither of them realised was that they were about to embark on a journey that would test not just Celine's vocal abilities, but her psychological resilience in ways that would make or break her. Chapter 3. The Pressure Cooker of Perfection. Imagine being 18 years old and having to completely reinvent yourself while battling demons that no one else can see. Not just your image or your style, but your very language, your way of expressing the deepest emotions through song, all while fighting a war inside your own mind. This was the challenge facing Celine Dion in 1986, when Renée Angelil made a decision that seemed almost reckless. If Celine was going to conquer the world, she needed to master English. What he didn't anticipate was how this pressure would amplify the anxiety that was already threatening to consume his young protégé. For a young woman who had only ever sung in French, who had built her entire identity around the lyrical beauty of her native language, this wasn't just a career move, it was a complete dismantling of everything that had made her feel safe. Renée arranged for Celine to disappear from public view for 18 months, a risky gamble in an industry where absence often means irrelevance. During this time, she would learn English, study with vocal coaches, and transform herself from a regional star into someone who could compete on the global stage. But what looked like an artist retreat was actually an intensive psychological boot camp that pushed Celine to her breaking point. The process was more challenging than anyone had anticipated, made exponentially worse by Celine's perfectionist tendencies and crushing fear of failure. Learning to sing in English isn't simply a matter of pronunciation, it's about understanding the emotional weight of words, the way English syllables sit differently on the tongue, the subtle rhythms that make a song feel authentic rather than translated. For someone already prone to anxiety, the pressure to master not just a new language but an entirely new way of expressing emotion was overwhelming. Celine threw herself into this challenge with the same intensity she brought to everything else. But the cost was enormous. She was spending up to 12 hours a day in lessons and practice sessions, working with vocal coaches, language tutors and cultural consultants who were trying to help her understand not just how to pronounce English words, but how to inhabit them emotionally. The young woman who had always been thin became almost skeletal, surviving on nervous energy and an obsessive need to get everything exactly right. Her panic attacks, which had been manageable when she was performing familiar material in her native language, became daily occurrences. She would wake up in cold sweats, convinced that she would never master English well enough to be taken seriously, that audiences would hear her accent and dismiss her as a novelty act. The safe space that music had always provided was no longer safe. Every English word felt foreign in her mouth. Every melody felt like a trap waiting to expose her inadequacy. René, watching his protégé struggle, began to understand that they were dealing with something far more complex than simple stage nerves. He arranged for Celine to work with a therapist who specialised in performance anxiety, but Celine was resistant, convinced that seeking help was an admission of weakness that would somehow diminish her artistry. She had internalised the belief that her anxiety was the price she had to pay for her talent, that managing it was simply part of being a professional. During this period of transformation, something both beautiful and terrifying happened. Rather than losing her French-Canadian identity, Celine found ways to blend it with her new English-speaking persona, but the psychological cost was immense. Her accent, which some advisors suggested she eliminate entirely, became part of her charm, but she lived in constant fear that it made her sound unprofessional. Every interview, every recording session, every casual conversation became a minefield where she might reveal her insecurity about her English skills. The breakthrough came gradually, through a combination of relentless practice and small victories that slowly built her confidence. Her vocal coach, a patient woman named Diane, who had worked with several bilingual artists, helped Celine understand that her accent wasn't a flaw to be hidden, but a unique quality that set her apart from other English-speaking singers. More importantly, Diane helped Celine develop breathing techniques and mental exercises that could help manage her anxiety without eliminating the emotional vulnerability that made her performances so powerful. When she emerged from this intensive period of study and preparation, the results were stunning, but the psychological scars ran deep. Her first English language album, Unison, released in 1990, showcased a voice that had not only mastered a new language, but had somehow become even more powerful in the process. Critics praised her technical brilliance and emotional authenticity, but they had no idea of the private war she had fought to achieve that seemingly effortless mastery. What happened next would test every coping mechanism she had developed during those 18 months of preparation, as the world's biggest stages were about to call her name, and with them, levels of pressure and scrutiny that would push her anxiety to dangerous new heights. Chapter 4. The Secret Behind the Crown Jewel. Every great artist has that one moment when everything changes, when they step from being merely successful to becoming legendary. For Celine Dion, that moment came wrapped in the most unlikely package, a song from a movie about a sinking ship, recorded during what she would later describe as the darkest period of her career, a time when her panic attacks had become so severe that she was secretly planning to retire from music altogether. The year was 1997, and despite her outward success, Celine was drowning. Her panic attacks had evolved from pre-performance jitters into a constant state of dread that followed her everywhere. She would wake up each morning with her heart racing, convinced that this would be the day her voice would fail her, that audiences would finally see through what she believed was an elaborate charade. The pressure of maintaining her image as the confident, powerful vocalist had become unbearable. René, desperate to help his now wife and artistic partner, had quietly arranged for Celine to work with Dr. Sarah Chen, a psychiatrist who specialised in performance anxiety among elite artists. Dr. Chen's patient files read like a who's who of entertainment, filled with Grammy winners and Oscar recipients who lived in constant fear that their next performance would expose them as frauds. What she discovered about Celine's condition was both heartbreaking and illuminating. Celine wasn't just dealing with stage fright, she was suffering from a severe form of performance anxiety complicated by what psychologists call imposter syndrome. Despite her obvious talent and years of success, she genuinely believed that she was fooling everyone, that she was somehow less deserving of acclaim than other artists. Every positive review felt like a temporary reprieve from inevitable exposure. Every standing ovation felt like evidence that she had managed to trick another audience into believing she belonged on that stage. The panic attacks had become ritualistic and elaborate. Before every performance, Celine would spend hours in what she called her worry spiral, obsessively checking and rechecking every aspect of her preparation, convinced that any small oversight would lead to disaster. She would practice the same songs dozens of times, not because she didn't know them, but because she needed constant reassurance that her voice would cooperate when it mattered most. It was during this psychological crisis that James Cameron approached her about recording the theme song for Titanic. The movie seemed like an impossible project, a 3-hour epic about a historical tragedy with a massive budget and relatively unknown leads. When Cameron played the melody for My Heart Will Go On, Celine's first reaction wasn't artistic, it was pure terror. The song was deceptively simple, which meant there would be nowhere to hide if she couldn't deliver. Every note would be exposed, every breath would be scrutinised. Initially, Celine refused to record the song. She told Renee that the melody was too repetitive, too simple, but the real reason was that she was convinced she would ruin it. The song felt like a test she was destined to fail, another opportunity for the world to discover that she wasn't as talented as everyone believed. Renee had to use every bit of his influence and their personal relationship to convince her to even record a demo. The recording session for My Heart Will Go On was unlike anything the studio engineers had ever witnessed. Celine arrived 3 hours early, spending the time in a small side room, hyperventilating and practicing breathing exercises Dr. Chen had taught her. She had prepared so obsessively that she knew every nuance of the melody by heart, but she was convinced that when the red recording light came on, everything would fall apart. What happened next became the stuff of legend, but not for the reasons most people think. When Celine stepped into the vocal booth and began to sing those opening lines, something extraordinary occurred. All the anxiety, all the fear, all the months of therapy and preparation crystallized into something transcendent. Her voice didn't just perform the song, it inhabited it, transforming what could have been a generic ballad into something that felt like a prayer, a lament, a celebration of love's ability to transcend even death itself. The engineers in the control room were moved to tears, but Celine couldn't see their reaction from inside the booth. All she knew was that she had made it through the song without her voice cracking, without forgetting the words, without any of the disasters she had imagined. When she finished, there was a moment of silence that felt eternal, and then Renee's voice came through the headphones. That's it. That's the one. But even as everyone around her celebrated what they recognised as a career-defining performance, Celine was convinced she had failed. She insisted on doing take after take, each one technically perfect but lacking the raw vulnerability of that first attempt. It took hours of gentle persuasion from Renee and the production team to convince her that the first take was not just adequate, but magical. The song's success was unprecedented, but for Celine, it represented something more profound than commercial triumph. For the first time in her career, she had managed to channel her anxiety into artistry rather than being paralysed by it. The vulnerability that terrified her had become the very quality that made the performance so powerful. She began to understand that her fear wasn't something to be eliminated, but something to be transformed. Chapter 5. The Unravelling and the Rebuilding. Behind every great artist's public triumphs lie private struggles that shape not just their art, but their very survival. For Celine Dion, the late 1990s and early 2000s brought both the highest highs and the most devastating lows of her life, as the success of My Heart Will Go On paradoxically pushed her anxiety to dangerous new levels, leading to a breakdown that nearly ended everything. The success of Titanic and its theme song created a level of global scrutiny that Celine was psychologically unprepared to handle. Suddenly, she wasn't just a successful recording artist, she was a cultural phenomenon, with every performance, every interview, every public appearance analysed and dissected by millions of people around the world. For someone already struggling with imposter syndrome and performance anxiety, this level of attention was devastating. The panic attacks that had once been confined to pre-performance rituals began bleeding into every aspect of her life. She would have episodes in restaurants, in hotel lobbies, during casual conversations with friends. Her world began to shrink as she started avoiding situations where she might lose control, where someone might see her in a moment of vulnerability that would shatter the image of the confident superstar. René, watching his wife suffer, felt helpless in a way he had never experienced. He had built his career on solving problems, on finding ways to showcase Celine's talent and protect her from the harsh realities of the music business. But this was something he couldn't manage or negotiate away. The enemy wasn't a difficult record executive or a hostile critic. It was Celine's own mind, and it was winning. The breaking point came during what should have been a triumphant moment. Celine was scheduled to perform at a major awards ceremony, a performance that was meant to celebrate her incredible year and cement her status as one of the world's premier vocalists. But backstage, she was in the grip of the worst panic attack of her life, convinced that she was having a heart attack, that she was going to die on live television in front of millions of viewers. Dr. Chen was called to the venue, finding Celine hyperventilating in her dressing room, her entire body shaking uncontrollably. For the first time, Celine admitted that she couldn't go on, that the fear had become bigger than her love of music, that she was ready to walk away from everything rather than continue living in this state of constant terror. The decision to take a hiatus wasn't announced as a mental health break. In 1999, such admissions were still career suicide in the entertainment industry. Instead, it was presented as Celine taking time to focus on starting a family, a narrative that was both true and strategically safe. But behind closed doors, Celine was fighting for her psychological survival with the same intensity she had once brought to perfecting her craft. The treatment process was unlike anything she had experienced. Dr. Chen introduced her to cognitive behavioral therapy, helping her understand that the thoughts and fears that seemed so real and immediate were actually patterns that could be identified, challenged, and changed. Celine learned that her perfectionism, rather than being a strength, had become a prison that made every performance feel like a life or death situation. More importantly, she began to understand the connection between her childhood experiences and her adult anxiety. The shy little girl who had hidden behind her mother's skirt was still there, still terrified of disappointing people, still convinced that any mistake would result in the love and approval being withdrawn. The therapy helped her see that her worth as a person wasn't dependent on delivering perfect performances, that she could be loved and valued even if she occasionally hit a wrong note or forgot a lyric. The process of learning to manage her anxiety coincided with her journey to motherhood, which brought its own challenges and revelations. The fertility treatments, the disappointments, the hope that seemed to slip away again and again, these experiences added new layers to her understanding of vulnerability and resilience. When she sang about longing now, audiences could hear not just technical brilliance, but the weight of lived experience in every note. The birth of René Charles in 2001 brought joy that seemed to radiate from Celine's very being, but it also brought new anxieties. Now she wasn't just worried about her own performances, She was terrified that her career demands would somehow damage her child, that the anxiety that had plagued her might be passed on to the next generation. Motherhood forced her to confront her fears in a new way, not just for her own sake, but for her son's future. When she returned to performing, something fundamental had changed. The woman who took the stage was still technically brilliant, still capable of moving audiences to tears, but there was a new quality to her presence, a groundedness that came from having faced her demons and survived. She had learned that true strength isn't about never falling down. It's about getting back up, taking the stage and singing with your whole heart, even when that heart carries the weight of fear and hope all tangled together. The Las Vegas residency that began in 2003 became more than just entertainment. It became a laboratory where Celine could experiment with new ways of managing her anxiety while still delivering the level of performance her audiences expected. The controlled environment, the familiar venue, the routine, all of these elements helped create a space where she could be both vulnerable and powerful, where her anxiety could coexist with her artistry rather than threatening to destroy it. Chapter 6. The Voice That Conquered Fear. As we reach the final chapter of tonight's journey with Celine Dion, we find ourselves contemplating something profound. What it means to transform your greatest weakness into your most authentic strength. Celine's story in recent years has been one of remarkable courage, of learning to embrace vulnerability not as something to hide, but as the very source of her connection with audiences around the world. The loss of Renee in January 2016 brought a different kind of challenge, one that tested every coping mechanism she had developed over decades of managing her anxiety. For over 30 years, he had been not just her manager and husband, but her emotional anchor, the person who could talk her through panic attacks and remind her of her worth when her own mind turned against her. His passing left a void that seemed impossible to fill, and for the first time since her breakdown in the late 1990s, Celine found herself facing the prospect of performing without her primary source of security and support. The funeral performance, where Celine sang the prayer with such raw emotion that it seemed to channel grief itself, marked a turning point in her relationship with her own vulnerability. For years, she had tried to hide her anxiety, to present a facade of effortless confidence. But standing there, singing for the man who had believed in her when she couldn't believe in herself, she realized that her authenticity, including her fears and struggles, was actually her greatest gift to audiences. What has been remarkable to witness is how Celine has navigated this profound loss while maintaining her commitment to her artistry, but with a new understanding of what that artistry actually represents. Her performances during this period have carried a different quality, not diminished, but deepened, informed by an understanding that vulnerability and strength aren't opposites, but partners in the dance of authentic human expression. The diagnosis of stiff person syndrome in 2022 brought yet another challenge, one that struck at the very heart of what makes Celine who she is. This rare neurological condition affects muscle control and coordination, making it difficult for her to perform with the precision and power that had defined her career. For someone whose voice had been both her greatest gift and her greatest source of anxiety, this diagnosis represented a test unlike any other. But here's where the decades of work on her mental health paid dividends in ways that no one could have anticipated. Rather than retreating into the familiar patterns of panic and self-doubt, Celine approached this new challenge with a resilience that surprised even her closest friends and family. She had learned, through years of therapy and self-reflection, that her worth wasn't dependent on her ability to hit perfect high notes or deliver flawless performances. Her decision to share her diagnosis publicly, through documentaries and interviews, represented the final step in a journey that began with a terrified 12-year-old hiding in recording studios. The woman who had once been paralysed by the fear of appearing weak or imperfect was now choosing to show the world her struggles with dignity and grace. understanding that her honesty might help others facing similar challenges. What strikes me most about Celine's recent years is how she has embraced change while remaining fundamentally herself, but with a new understanding of what herself actually means. She has become a fashion icon in ways that surprise and delight, showing up at events in outfits that demonstrate a playful confidence that was always there, but perhaps overshadowed by the intensity of her fears. She has proven that reinvention doesn't require abandoning who you are. Sometimes it means discovering parts of yourself that were waiting for the right moment to emerge. Her influence on younger artists extends far beyond vocal technique. She has shown multiple generations of performers that it's possible to be both commercially successful and psychologically honest, that audiences don't just want perfection, they want authenticity. They want to see themselves reflected in the struggles and triumphs of the artists they love. The young singers who cite Celine as an influence often mention not just her vocal abilities, but her courage in facing her fears publicly, her willingness to admit that even superstars struggle with self-doubt and anxiety. In a social media age where mental health awareness is finally becoming acceptable, Celine's journey from hidden panic attacks to open advocacy represents a kind of roadmap for artists who are fighting similar battles. As we consider Celine's legacy tonight, it's tempting to focus on the statistics, the album sales, the awards, the records broken, but the true measure of her impact lies in something far more personal. The countless individuals who have found not just comfort in her voice, but courage in her story. She has shown us that our deepest fears don't have to define us, that our greatest vulnerabilities can become our most powerful tools for connection. The little girl who once hid behind her mother's skirt, terrified that her voice would betray her, grew up to become a woman who uses that same voice to remind us all that it's okay to be afraid, as long as we don't let that fear stop us from singing our truth. In learning to manage her anxiety rather than be controlled by it, Celine didn't just save her career. She discovered a deeper, more authentic way of connecting with the world. As our journey through Celine Dion's hidden struggle concludes tonight, we're reminded that true courage isn't the absence of fear. It's the decision to keep singing despite the terror, to transform anxiety into authenticity, to use our deepest vulnerabilities as bridges to connect with others who are fighting similar battles. Celine's secret war with panic and self-doubt, hidden for decades behind a facade of effortless confidence, ultimately became the source of the very vulnerability that makes her performances so powerful. She taught us that perfection isn't the goal, connection is, and sometimes our broken places are exactly where the light gets in. Until our next diva story, this is the Sleeping Gay, encouraging you to remain curious about the hidden struggles that shape the artists we love. Sweet dreams, fellow dreamers, and may your rest be filled with the knowledge that even our fears can become sources of strength. Good night.